Liz Walker. I'm with WBZ TV, and I'm going to be the moderator for tonight's discussion. Women in Politics, Women in '88. This is co-sponsored by the Institute of Politics and the Kennedy School Women's Caucus. Lots of issues to address this evening. What I'm going to do is give you kind of a description of our format. And what we will do is I will introduce our four guests. I'll give you a brief introduction on each, and then we'll go back, and each will make a brief statement, hopefully around 7 or 8 minutes, ladies. I've been told that, well, you know politicians, 7 or 8 minutes, 30 minutes, half an hour, but we'll try to keep it brief so that we can talk with you, because that obviously is the main point here this evening, to discuss the issues facing women. My station about, 1984, leading to the national elections then, did a gender gap forum. And we had all of the Democratic presidential contenders in a debate, an open debate. I believe there were 8 at the time we did it. And the issue leading into the 1984 elections, at least for the Democratic Party, was women's issues. Was there a gender gap? Well, it turned out, 1984, that the gender gap didn't play a big role in politics, at least not for the Democrats. Geraldine Ferraro certainly wasn't successful. President Reagan had lots of women voting for him in his mandate. So the issue didn't break down on partisan lines. So the question is there a gender gap? Are there women's issues? The 1986 November elections will not go down in history as a banner year for women, at least not in raw numbers, with the exception of a new woman governor in Nebraska. There were no symbolic first this time around, no new seats won in Congress, and only one woman senator, newly woman senator, was elected, Democrat Barbara Mikulski in Maryland. So, as I said, in the context of numbers, there was nothing to celebrate. But I've been reading some research that says experts believe that women have come of age politically. And where maybe we can't talk about big numbers, we can talk about some political expertise that women have developed over the years, and women have been more effective in raising money, for instance, which is bottom line, and in running more technically effective campaigns. So with that as a little background tonight, we're going to discuss with our guests, what about running as a woman? Does that separate you? Does that make you different? Or is that no longer an issue? And then to address some of the issues that have been perceived as women's issues. Are there any real women's issues, or are they just issues of society? As I said before, I'm going to introduce our guests. They're going to each speak briefly. Then we're going to maybe talk back and forth and start the question and answer, and then we'll open it up to you. I have been told that there are mics set both on the lower level and in the balcony. I believe there are 2 mics each on each level, and I have been told by the Institute that you please keep your questions brief, and we don't want to hear your dissertations tonight, if you don't mind. But anyway, our guests tonight include Constance Morella, who is a Republican. She's from Maryland in the 8th District. Mrs. Morella comes to Congress after 2 terms as a member of the Maryland House of Representatives. She won her role as a congresswoman in a district that had been heavily Democratic and was at one point held by a liberal or considered liberal Democrat who went on to run for another office, and that was a wide open office. So Constance Morella is one of our women who will be speaking this evening. Our second guest, Susan McClain. Susan is in the New Hampshire Senate. This is her 3rd term. She's a Republican. She's assistant whip, and she's on the Senate Finance Committee. She's also has 8 new granddaughters under 5, right? Right. Susan McClain from New Hampshire. Our only Democrat this evening is Barbara Patton. And Barbara, incidentally, was a fellow at the Kennedy Institute. She is on the New York State Assembly. She serves as a lawmaker and representative for the 18th Assembly District in New York, which encompasses a part of Long Island in Nassau County. And our 4th speaker this evening is also a fellow in the Kennedy Institute, is Julie Bellaga. Did I pronounce that right? Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Julie certainly has a background in politics. She served as state representative, a Republican in Connecticut from 1976 to 1984. Mrs. Bellaga was the Republican Party's gubernatorial nominee in 1986. So our guests tonight offer a wide variety of political expertise and we'll hopefully be discussing a wide variety of issues. First of all, I present to you Constance Morella.
Thank you. Is it okay to take this up? Stand. Nobody's objecting. I'm delighted to be here. This is like coming back to my hometown. I grew up in Somerville, Massachusetts, went to Boston University. I'd have a constituency here, and then went off to Maryland, to Montgomery County, Maryland, and got involved in, and I'm an educator professionally, got involved in politics because I wanted to change things. And then now I end up in the 100th Congress. And I'm pleased to be there, and I'm particularly pleased to be here with you, looking around to see people who are here because they really care about politics. You know, I can remember the time when Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire were in the movies, and most of you can only know them from the Late Late Show. And at that time, they used to dance together, and it was ever so beautiful. And the only difference was the fact that Ginger Rogers danced backwards and wore high heels. And I think that is demonstrative of the fact that the women's movement has put the movement into women to know that they have had some liabilities of the past and they have to correct it. I'm just hoping that future shock will take place so that the movement can be faster than it has traditionally been. Because it was in my adopted state of Maryland in 1648 that Gentleman, and that's what she was called, Gentleman Margaret Brant, who handled 134 cases for the Maryland colony, wanted the right to vote for women. This is long before Abigail Adams in 1776 was writing to John about Remember the Ladies, and she was denied that opportunity and asked for it again very eloquently. So I'm hoping that, again, times will change so that we will have more than the 22 women that we now have in the House of Representatives of our Congress and 2 women in the state Senate. I can also remember, and again, I was in college at the time, in 1958, in terms of the burden that women have had to pay in terms of politics, a woman was running for re-election for the second time for the House of Representatives, and she had been elected on her own in her state of Minnesota without having replaced her deceased spouse or coming from a very prominent family name, which were the 2 avenues where a woman succeeded in politics. And this time she ran, and her husband had a letter printed in the local newspaper, which said, "Due to wifely neglect, my family life has deteriorated to the point where it is almost non-existent." And did she win the election? You guessed it. I wouldn't have mentioned it if she did. She did not win. She then later took him to court, and it was determined that he was an alcoholic, and that actually there was an influence on the election as a result of that letter being placed in the paper. She ran again, and did she win? No, she lost, because the damage had been ineradicable. And this has been kind of the burden that women traditionally have paid in politics, the fact that they have tried to be superwomen, and the responsibility for raising the family has rested on their shoulders, and they've been looked at more for the dialectic, not for the dialectic, but more for the decorative rather than the dialectic. But times are changing now, and certainly state legislatures bear that out, where women are running at greater numbers and are succeeding in even greater numbers. In Congress, the numbers aren't so good, except women are running, and I do see that there will be more successes. When I have had interns, both in the state legislature in Maryland and in Congress, they tell me, younger women, that they're planning to run for Congress themselves. This was not the case during my generation. In my generation, women always had the problem with the attitude. It's like recently, a test was given for women and men to enter medical school, and they queried those who did not pass the test and said, "Are you planning to run again, or to try to gain admission in the future?" And the men said, "Absolutely," a majority of them. And the women, very few of the women said, "Yes, I will try again." And so it's a matter of attitude is altitude, and I think traditionally women have not had the courage to realize that they could do it and the credibility to do it. But I think women don't have any trouble anymore with fundraising, because in many instances they've demonstrated they understand the community, they work hard, they have the preparation, they have the confidence in themselves. Now we just got to get more and more of them to get involved in the community, to testify on issues that they care about. And I know in this area it's a very active area in terms of involvement in issues, getting the press releases out, meeting with the leaders in the community, and then preparing to run. I have a famous or a favorite adage in kind of vulgate Latin, sine gutsibus non gloriosimus, which translates into no guts, no glory. And I think if we all followed that, it would be a much better country that we would have in terms of government. It also reminds me of a poster that someone had in an office that I appreciate, and it was we have a long way to go, and please don't call me baby. Thank you very much.
You were wonderful.
Okay.
Set the tone.
I'm here really, I think, because I have been co-chair of a group called the Women's Campaign Fund, which is dedicated to getting more women, progressive women, in public office. And I got involved in this group because I ran for Congress myself in 1980. Like Julie, I did my best and didn't win. But I tell you right now, it was the hardest thing I ever did in my life. I had tried out for the Olympics and had 5 babies and broke both my legs. I'd done a lot of things, but nothing was as hard as running for Congress. It really took me physically about 2 years to get over it. My stomach ached, I was hyper, I sweat in funny places that I never had before. It was, I was scared, I think, the entire time. And the Women's Campaign Fund meant so much to me, not only in terms of money, but psychologically. And so I have become very dedicated to this cause of getting more women to run for public office and getting them elected. They say that if, starting with Jeanette Radkin in 1917, who was the first woman in Congress, we're now up to 23. And if we progress at that rate, we are going to get to blessed equality, half women, not even 53% that we deserve, in 410 years. So we've got a battle to go. And really the good news was that there were 4 winners this year that were supported by the Women's Campaign Fund. They were all pro-choice. They were all qualified, experienced candidates. And that may be part of the difference. Dave Broder had an excellent article quoting a woman named Celinda Lake, who works for the Women's Campaign Fund. She talked about the first wave of politicians, and those were the women whose were replacing their husband or their brother that were coming into the Congress, and almost half of the women in Congress are there because their husbands died in office when you think about it. The second wave was sort of the do-gooders, the lady do-gooders. That was me, the League of Women Voters, the people who were concerned about the issues. And the third wave that we're seeing now are the really experienced women that have been in public office. The average was 8 to 12 years, I think, for the 4 women who did run. When I first ran for the legislature in 1969, there were 56 women. We are the 3rd largest English-speaking parliamentary body in the world, if you remember. There are 400 in the New Hampshire legislature, and we at one time had more women in our legislature than all the other legislatures in the country combined. We now have 136 women. At the time I first ran, there were no chairmen. They're now, the minority leader is a woman. Over half the chairmen of committees, they're still chairmen, but they are women. In my Senate, there are 8 out of 24, and I think that we've come to a point where really sex is not an issue and it's a matter of power within our legislature. But New Hampshire is one of 8 states in the country that has never elected a woman to Congress or elected a woman statewide. In the last election, it was a hard time for me to put a good face on the results of the election. I thought we did terribly. And the next day, the women's movement all got together and put a good side to it. And there were some bright points, most of them being in the U.S., in the Congress, the 4 women who won. There are now 3 women governors. There are 25 women that have won statewide, that are in office now statewide, 6 lieutenant governors. The governors, you know, are Madeleine Kunin, Governor Orr of Nebraska and Governor Collins. There were some really bad losses, mostly for the governorship. Carolyn Warner in Arizona and Arlis Sturgielewski in Alaska. Arlis lost by 4%. And those were women, along with Madeline Kunin, that you saw something happen, that a third man got in the race. And a third man was the difference that made these people lose. You had 8 women challengers who lost running for governor. But as I say, you did have the fact that they were more experienced candidates that were running. Now we've got Connie Morella and Pat Psaki and Louise Slaughter and Liz Patterson in the Congress, and you do have Sala Burton, who died recently, who was the 23rd member of the Congress, and her seat is being contested by, I believe, several people, but among them are 2 or 3 women. In fact, our Women's Campaign Fund has decided that we can't get into that race because there were so many. I want to close now with a thought about the fact of women running, and I want to quote Celinda Lake, who is the Women's Campaign Fund person. She says, "There are still barriers to seeing women as chief executives. Basically, women are seen as good listeners and as caring about people, so they are viewed as good at constituency service and legislative posts. They are not seen as good at budgets or managing macro level, things that people want in a chief executive." There's a wonderful example of a woman running for governor, and her opponent kept showing himself in a tank calling out the National Guard. Well, there was one obscure law that said that the governor could call out the National Guard, and obviously what he was trying to point out was that when it really came down to the tough stuff, how could she climb in a tank with a skirt on? And so that is it is a factor, and it continues to be. So I guess maybe the last thing I would like to say is I come from Krista McAuliffe's hometown, and I used to teach Krista's class a couple of times a year, talking about this issue of women running for public office. And I remember the last time having a really awful time because these young people in high school saw no reason why you should have more women. Well, what's wrong with that? You know, haven't the voters chosen? Aren't the men doing a good enough job? And so that I became very conscious that what is my cause, which is to elect more women to public office, isn't everybody's cause. And therefore I'm very appreciative of the size of this audience and the interest that you have in having more women run for public office.
First of all, let me say that it is indeed my pleasure to be back at the Institute, having been a fellow here just, I guess, maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. And so it's always good to be back at the Institute, and it certainly is good to see so many people in the audience. I had the experience just recently to go to one of the junior high schools in my district. I represent a district in Long Island in New York, which is unique in that it has given me the opportunity to be the first minority ever elected in the history of the legislature to represent a suburban district. I have a district that has only a 34% black population, and I first ran for the seat and won it in 1982. And that was very unique. And so I go back to this district quite frequently, and I talk to young people there. And I was before a junior high school class a couple of months ago, and I said to them, this group of maybe 12, 13, 14-year-olds, we have 211 people in the New York State Legislature in the 2 houses. How many women do you think that we have elected to those offices? And invariably, young people were yelling out, probably around 50%. And And when I told them that I hated to disappoint them, that in fact we only had about 10%, one of the youngsters, a little boy, stood up and he said, maybe it's because there's a test to get in and the girls can't pass the test. And I was the chair of the Women's Legislative Caucus at the time, and I took that back and I said, girls, we have got to get out there and get a new test together, because this is how we're going to get more elections together. And I talked about this district that I represented, and we talked about how it is that we started to win, and we've started to win a little bit better than we had in the past. But I do remember very clearly in 1982 doing something that was very different and very different for the district that I had. And I did it for a very simple reason. We had no money to run a campaign, and there were not very many people that were going to donate money to a black woman who was going to represent a district in all Republican Long Island. So what was suggested to me was that we do kind of what Jimmy Carter did and some of the things that we had done for him in Long Island, and that was going door to door and running a real flesh-on-flesh campaign. And so from April of 1982 until Election Day in 1982, that November, I walked every day, 6 days a week, 7 hours every day. And I have to tell you something, by November 3rd, I was sick of it. And even then, my staff said to me, you still have to keep walking. So I remembered even walking then door to door on that election day. But that, in fact, and there's no question in my mind, that in fact is how I won. But it was a very difficult task then, because what invariably was happening was that if I was in a blue-collar community, for instance, clearly I did not mention the fact that I was in Women's Strike for Peace back in the good old days of the 70s and dragging two little kids around Washington carrying placards. I was indicating to people as I went door to door that I was a neighbor, that I believed in the same things you did, that I was a woman and I was a minority, but I had gone to law school and I had done all of these things and I want to represent you. And sometimes the responses were really interesting, because I remember taking my son with me once, who was maybe at the time 17 or 18, and this man said to me, what's going to happen to your kids as you're down up there in Albany running around and you know there's a lot of guys up there? What's going to happen to your kids? And my son, who was at that time about 6 feet tall, said, my mother can go to Albany if she wants to. And this guy was literally stopped in his tracks. And I have to tell you something, I campaigned last year and I saw him. And what was really interesting was I didn't have my son with me now. My son wouldn't dare campaign with me now. He's not interested in politics. But at any rate, we walk up to this door and I'm thinking to myself, I remember this house. And sure enough, the same guy with the same bulldog and the same 3 tattoos came to the door. And he had a cigarette dangling from his mouth. And the dog was barking. It's a true story. And he turned around, looked down at the dog, and he said to the dog, stop barking. Don't you recognize your assemblywoman? Okay? Now, what's so great about that story is, A, that he has consistently now voted for me 3 times at least. At first, my son told him it was all right, and the last 2 times he in fact thought it was okay. And outside of that, the fact is that as a woman, as a minority, as someone who is clearly in the minority party-wise in the area that I represent, that I have been able to attract a large constituency. And last year, in 1984 and last year, won by a majority of a plurality of 66 and 67% of the vote, and have been able to capture this seat through a lot of very, very hard work. I've also, though, been able to turn around some things, and I think that the key to many of the things that we do and we have to do as women, certainly we need a constituency to back us, but we need the dollars. And I think that while there is general agreement that women are able now to attract dollars, and there are people that are willing to, in fact, contribute to our campaigns, we do have women campaigns funds. There's a great organization called Emily's. Emily stands for Early Money is Like Yeast. And it's so true that, you know, you start to give this money very early, and then people start to build on that for you. And all of those things are around. But I have to tell you something that I do believe, and I don't walk around carrying my gender on my shoulder as a chip, because I clearly believe that that will not get us anyplace. But I do tell you that there are still a lot of subtleties around, and those subtleties I think we have to be very careful and very aware of. That we need pluralities, and we need to win, and we need to narrow the gap, and in fact we are doing that. But the We'll probably respond to some things like that if you'll give us a chance to finish our opening remarks. You're welcome. I'm sure you are. But the fact of the matter is that we have to be consistent, and we have to stay in there, and we have to keep attempting to narrow that gap. The fact of the matter is that we still do, for as much as we've gained, we still have a lot of ground to cover. I've been saying to people just recently that 11 years ago I was a housewife. In those 11 years, I've run for office 3 times. I've raised 2 children who are both in their 20s at this point. I finished law school. I finished a bachelor's degree. I finished law school. And I sometimes wake up in the morning and say to myself, how did I do all of that? And then I remembered some things that my grandmother would say to me as she was raising 10 children and 10 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren by herself, having been widowed at 30. That when you wake up in the morning and you're really looking for somebody to pair yourself with, to really get some things done, look in the mirror, and if you can't do it yourself, you better go and try and find some help. So I've been very fortunate. I've looked in the mirror a lot, and I've done a lot for myself. I've had family. I've had a lot of good support systems, and I've had a lot of women throughout New York State and throughout this country who have given me help. So I'm just glad to be here. I enjoy what I do. I do it for a living. It puts kids through college. It pays a mortgage. It pays rent on an apartment. And I plan and hope to be here for a while, and certainly hope to increase our numbers with or without a test in New York State. Thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I didn't expect to be here. You will have seen by the flyer that my name was not on the list. I was here a couple of weeks ago in this very forum as a fellow at the Institute of Politics, and I'm having an extraordinary 4 months assessing where I go from here. And it has given me a very good opportunity to look back at the campaign in 1986. I ran for governor of my state in Connecticut. And I'm going to reiterate some of the things that Susan talked to you about. The Women's Campaign Fund was wonderful to me and for me. And some of the facts that they brought out are really very true today. This past campaign leading up to the November 1986 was very unique. I am convinced of it, and I think if any of you followed it carefully, you will know that the women who were running for office this year, whether they lost or they won, as Connie and some of the others who were new to the particular race they were running, the seat they were running for, they were women with very good credentials. And I come out of the Connecticut legislature. I had been there for 10 years. I ended up in 1985 as the deputy majority leader of the Connecticut House of Representatives. When I suddenly came to the reality that I didn't want to stay in the Connecticut legislature all my life, the 10 years was really adequate, that in fact the issues become redundant, and you can only debate certain things for so many years without getting ho-hum about them, and I don't like to do anything that's ho-hum. I decided I would take a shot and run for governor. I will tell you, unlike you, Susan, it was not the hardest thing in my life. It was an extraordinary experience. I loved every single minute of it. It was a most unique opportunity for me to speak to issues I cared passionately about, and the one thing I'm not is shy. I care a lot about a lot of issues, and I had been in the Connecticut legislature and watching with an extremely high level of frustration what I considered a very inadequate government for a very spectacular state. And so the opportunity to run for governor was a chance for me to speak out on things I cared an awful lot about. One of the things I have said to women's groups around my area, and certainly in the New England area, where I do try to talk a lot to women's groups, is that if you're not willing to take a risk, you shouldn't be in the political world. It is, in fact, a high-level risk-oriented kind of phenomenon, and women have got to be willing to take those chances. They have got to be willing to say, look, I have something to say, I care deeply about those issues, I'm going to fight for those issues, and win, lose, or draw, I'm going to be out there in the mix, and I'm going to be talking about those issues. And I think that women are beginning to be more willing to do that. Men have done it for years, and it's our turn to stand up there and say, hey, these are the things we care about, and these are the things that we want you to address. It's very interesting watching legislatures around the nation, and Susan comes from New Hampshire, where the New Hampshire legislature has a very high number of women in office there. But in truth, I mean, let's tell them the truth, Susan, the pay scale is very little there, and so it has always been assumed that as long as you don't pay them very much, the competition for those slots is perhaps less violent than the competition for slots of Congress or what have you. And so the numbers, where you see this very dramatic pyramid, where it is more difficult to get to the top of that power structure, is invariably going to be tougher and tougher for women, and it's tougher and tougher for men. I mean, come on, let's lay this out there. As you are going into positions of power, you are going to be competing at a very tough level, and you have to be prepared, and you have to know the issues, you have to be fast on your feet, and you have to be prepared to go right to the wall when you care. And I think women are learning to do that, and boy, does that make me feel good. And boy, does that send a signal for the future. But we have a long way to go. I really don't believe that we should in any way assume, because there's a group of women here that can speak to issues, that in fact we have made all the changes that are going to be necessary as women move into the year 2000, because they really are not represented adequately in any of the decision-making bodies of our nation. It's very interesting in legislative context. The public seems to be comfortable with women as legislators, as women who will respond to constituent needs. It is, in fact, much tougher to move into the executive branch, where the decisions, the policies, the final, where the buck stops. And so the battle there has been very difficult. I'll share with you some of the interesting things that happened in my campaign, and which I found really interesting and not unexpected. One of the things that I got a tremendous chuckle over, when it first happened, I thought, well, that's an extraordinary experience. It happened so many times, I decided there really was a message out there. And when I would be in debates, and I was in a number of debates with my opponents, first in a primary, I got enough to primary in my state, and I won the primary, and then I went on to contest the incumbent governor. I would be in forums like this, and invariably, some guy would come up, put his hands on his hips afterwards and say, well, how about that? What's a nice lady like you doing in a place like this? And I thought, well, he could be sending me 3 signals, and I'm not sure which one it is. Number one, it could be politics is really dirty business, and it doesn't, and women don't belong there. Well, that's bunk, but that's his problem. Or number 2, politics is dirty business, and why aren't you home with the Lysol? Or politics is dirty business, and thank God you're there. Because we need a woman's perspective, and it is absolutely critical that women be part of the decision-making and be involved in the policies that are going to affect our lives. Now, one of the things that Liz broached was this question, and I thought it was interesting, of gender gap and what are women's issues, and I have to tell you, it is tougher and tougher to define what are women's issues. Because, in fact, women today are involved in the whole panoply of decision-making. And so there are very few things that you can say are identifiably women's issues anymore, although there are certain issues that women care very deeply about and take a lead. But if it weren't for men participating in discussions of rape crisis centers and taking a lead in the whole question of daycare as a clearly critical issue for the working families, if men were not involved in some of those decisions, we probably wouldn't be able to pull them off. But it has been, in fact, women who have taken the lead on those issues and who have set the agenda for them. So women in legislative bodies and women in the executive branch are going to be critical, particularly as we see a whole new role for women. And gee, I really come out of that, the 1950s. I really am the traditional woman who I too, Connie, am an educator. I'm a former school teacher who left teaching to be home to raise my family, and it really were my kids who said, hey, Mom, why don't you get back in the fray, who really helped me to get out there and do my thing and take a role. But women today are, in fact, offered the most extraordinary array of opportunities. Those opportunities are fantastic, and it is critical that they be part of the decision-making process, and for that reason, women have got to learn to be aggressive as it talks to the question of networking, and very aggressive as you talk to the question of risk-taking, because if you're not willing to take a gamble, if you're not willing to take a risk, then you're never going to be able to make it in terms of public policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. In about 10 minutes, we're going to open this up to question and answer from you. And I did want to let you know that a question was raised up in the balcony that we are going to address. Everyone has agreed that they definitely wanted to address it. It was just a matter of timing on that. One question that I wanted to ask immediately, I think that's something that's come through to me. We've talked about women's successes in politics on the local versus the national level, and it seems that more women are entering politics at the local level, which is understandable, and are more successful at the local level. Susan, you scared me to death when you explained how scared you were about a run at a higher office. Should women, and I'll pose this to you, Congresswoman Morella, should women be intimidated? Should we be intimidated to run for those kinds of races, for Congresswoman or for national office? Should we be limited to this local arena? Are we more powerful there, do you think?
Not at all. I think there should be no limitations. As Fiorello said, right you are if you think you are. It's your own perception of yourself. We talked a little bit about where we came from in terms of the political scene when we ran. I ran in a county, Montgomery, very progressive county, at the just over the District of Columbia line. And actually, the registration is 2-to-1 Democratic, and I was introduced as a Republican. I also ran against, in the general election, a gentleman who served with me in the state legislature who spent $1.5 million in that election. I must say we spent a little over $650,000, which is an incredibly large sum, which indicates how important fundraising is, because I don't have the private means to be able to fund my own campaign. But despite those odds, we won 53% of the vote. How did it come about? I don't think the sex made any difference. I remember during press conferences being asked, does your sex make a difference? I said, there's nothing I can do about it. So that stopped the question right there. However, it was sheer hard work, and the fact that I believed that despite the odds that I could win. I knew it was possible, and it worked out well. I also, as was mentioned, I also knocked on doors. I'd done it during my legislative time, and I didn't do it. It was only one facet. When you're running a congressional campaign, you've got multi-facets, 25 debates, as a matter of fact, answering questionnaires, going out to senior centers. But I also knocked on doors, and I have, just in the way of backdrop in terms of the uniqueness, my husband and I have 3 children and the 6 children of my late sister, whom we took from Melrose, Massachusetts 12 years ago when my sister died of cancer. So I had a mini precinct in my own house. And that's how I won the election. They know who pays the tuition and whatever. And so, as a matter of fact, in the door knocking, since they really grew up with my knocking on doors, they would say, please elect our mother and get her off the streets. But in my old age, I got so good I would even come back from knocking on doors with checks, and I'd say, see, you thought I was too old for this? I'd come back with a $250 check, and it's not even dark out. So it all has to do with whether we believe we can do it, and there is no reason why we can't. Quite frankly, women always have had to work harder, and now we're trying to equalize it so we don't have to work as hard. But no problem. It's really all attitude.
Okay. And everyone can feel free to.
I think one of the things that's important to say is that one of the reasons that you don't have as many women in Congress as you might expect is because in this election, 98.5% of the incumbents won. And by definition, 95% of those incumbents are male. And so that in the last, and I think that when I talked about how hard it was, it partly was the physical strain. the shoes, the drive. I drove 14,000 miles, or I was driven. I had a long district from the Canadian border to Massachusetts. And just the being in a car and you're trying to sit so you're not wrinkling your skirt, and you're reading the New York Times and so that you can know all the issues of the day, and you've got to know the directions where you're going, and so that you're never relaxed in a whole day. And I think that's literally the physical strain of the hours and the smiling. You know, just try going like this for an hour. Just try it. And you hurt so right across here that, but I think the other thing is, and I was looking back at the 84 election, and I think all of us can feel some empathy with Geraldine Ferrero, how hard she worked and how tough that was for her to lose. But there were also 9 women who ran for the Senate, the U.S. Senate that time, and they all lost. And there were 39 out of the 41 women that ran for the House, all lost. And so I think it is this problem of being up against the incumbency, and the fact, as you say, Julie, you've got to be ready to lose, because a lot of times you're gonna.
I think that the only thing I can add to that is that, you know, we talk about what we can accomplish, and clearly the sky's the limit for what we, in fact, can do. But I think that as women that we can't lose sight of, and we must be realistic about certain things. I have been in the political arena now since 1982, actively running for office. And I have done that with a support system, literally, of a family that's been behind me, but at a distance, okay? My family was made up of 2 children and myself. I don't have a spouse, okay? In that 11-year period, one thing I neglected to tell you is I got a divorce somewhere in the process also. But I think that one of the things that when I talk to other women, it's important to have a support system, and it's important to have someone for you, okay? Now, a lot of times that someone is not a spouse, and it's not a person of the opposite sex. It's not someone that you need for anything other than just to boost you and to keep you going, okay? But at the same time, we live in a society with all the progress that we've made, and I knew it through law school. I went to law school, and I went to a law school, a Hofstra University Law School, where they had accepted 8 women that year, and it was so great, and boy, oh boy, what a big thing they had done. But I have to tell you something. When they tacked up something on the outside of the classroom, they would say, one of your children is sick, okay? And invariably, one of us would say, could you take the wills, trust, and estate class for me? Could you take the contracts class for me? We still had the responsibility of the children. And that doesn't leave you when you're running for office. That's another real big responsibility. Now, one of the things I didn't want to sacrifice were my children. So I used to take them to campaign with me. So I said, today, neither one of them is interested. My daughter's going on to medical school. My son is finished college, and he's off, has his own business, and he's doing very well, fine. But the fact of the matter is that we have to do a lot of things that, whether, as far as we've come, society has still not let us go completely to the other end of the spectrum. Even today, I have been called off the floor of the legislature. Your daughter is sick and she's in the hospital. I got on a plane and I flew down to Atlanta, Georgia. I'm talking about a 21, 22-year-old adult who was sick, but it's still my child. And I have to tell you something, that is a big factor. Of the women that I talked to in the legislature, and again, this is a generational thing, the women who are in the legislature who are in their 30s, most of them are not married. And they tell you very honestly, they don't want the responsibility of children. I have a son who is a grown man who comes home once a week to wash his laundry. You know what? The last person I talked to yesterday before I left for Albany was my son. He's 24 years old. He's not married, but he lives 8 blocks from home. And he still comes to say, Ma, what are you guys going to be debating this week? Should I really listen? Are you not interested? Why isn't Mario running? Those types of, I relate to this kid.
Why isn't Mario running?
Well, that's another forum, okay? But the fact of the matter is that regardless of where we go and who we are, we still have certain responsibilities that, quite frankly, our male counterparts are not going to pick up. I don't care how we cut it. I don't care how we look at it. And that also adds to a lot of the tension. Let me just tell you one other thing. We have a colleague of mine who has served in the legislature now for 14 years. He's an excellent legislator. We go to him for a lot of things. He married a woman who was counsel to one of the major standing committees, and they had a baby last year. And she was going to be one of these people, quote, that was going to raise this child with benign neglect. You know, she was going to be very progressive, and she gave this child to this male legislator. Well, I have to tell you something. He used to come to committee meetings with this baby. He'd bring this baby on the floor of the assembly. When we would have a function, he would bring the baby with him when it was his time to watch this baby. And then I started to watch him. Invariably, he'd go to one of the women legislators. Could you help me out?
Sure. Never asked me.
Right? My son is wet. And I remember one of the young women turned to him and she said, we've all done wet. Change him yourself. Okay? And he came back this year. He made a deal. He said, the baby's not with him this year. But he said to me that, you know, it was the first time that I said to myself, how could I have campaigned, won an election, and served in the legislature if I had little people following behind me? Okay? And sometimes the little people have a 12.5 triple E foot, but they're still your little people and you're still responsible.
Liz's question was, are there limits? And I would suggest to you that she should wash her mouth with soap before she asks such a question. But in truth, there are some limits that are very real, and I think these women have addressed them for you. It is you know, it is the superwoman kind of a phenomenon that, in fact, you are expected to do all of the above and be very, very much the superhuman being, and we all have to work out those problems. It certainly does help, and it is almost impossible to accomplish without a supportive family. But I would suggest to you that I think that same problem is very real for our male colleagues who also need a supportive family. And you do see in the political mainstream some very difficult families, some problems with families sticking together because of the tremendous pressure. So you have to know what you're getting into. But I would like to suggest one other phenomenon that's out there, and it's kind of an interesting phenomenon, and someday I'd love to do some research on it because one of the things that I discovered, and have talked to some other colleagues who have run for statewide office, the role of the media in terms of women running for office. And what I discovered and I found really fascinating was that there were many women who covered my campaign, and I talked to another woman, a Democratic friend of mine who ran for Congress, who agreed with me that the women media people established tougher standards for women running for office, and that they expected us to be more perfect than our male counterparts. And someday let's do a seminar on that, another forum on that, because I do think that there was a sense amongst the women media people who wanted me to be perfect, larger than life, better than anybody, so that there would be never any sense that I or any of the other women running for office might blow it, so to speak. They felt a certain sense of affinity and wanted to make sure that we, in fact, did cut the mustard and therefore established some really tough standards for us. Interesting question.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I was going to cut you off just to show you how we treat each other.
Sure.
Shut up. No. That's a very good point. Well, I was going to raise a question and then quickly throw it open to the group. Do you believe, Kathy Wilson, chairperson of the Advisory Committee of the National Women's Political Caucus in Washington, has been quoted as saying that women nowadays are, and it's on the same line, are not as anxious to rally around women's candidates or women candidates. Do you think is that true? Is that on the same line that women are tougher on women? Do you think that women are kind of tough in that sense, your constituents?
Yeah, well, let me just say to you that I have said over and over again that I think that women tend to be their own worst enemies. In many instances, such as running for office, they are exceedingly critical of women, are very nervous about women in positions of authority. And part of that is the social mores, our times in which women are brought up to accede to a man. The man is going to make the decisions, and who are these pushy women who are going to be making the decisions? And so I think that women themselves have a long way to go, and they have a major role in educating each other about the need for women in positions of authority, and their own personal willingness to support women. That does not mean that you support a woman because she is a woman. I've said this 100 times. I don't want anybody voting for me because I'm a woman. And in the campaign, I sensed that was probably a wash. There were some people out there who would never vote for me because I was a woman. And then there were some people who would vote for me because I was a woman. I don't vote for me because I'm a woman or vote against me. Vote for me because I'm a very competent person who can do that job. And I think that women have to look at competent people who are women and say, I'm going to give you that extra measure of support. Up to now, it has been a limited group of people led by the kinds of things by Emily or by the Women's Campaign Fund or some of the groups that are peopled by women who have been through this before and need to educate women and men to the importance of women in positions of power. But women have got a long way to come on their own right.
We can take your questions from the floor now. If we'll set that up. There's somebody waiting in line there.
Look at that.
I know. We'll start over here. I think it's on. Already on. Is it on?
They'll pick you up fast.
I admire your stamina, your toughness, and you ladies are dynamite. You women are dynamite. See how hard it is for me. My question, though, is, although I believe in Ms. Patton's strategy and all of your strategy of walking on doors and hitting the beat, if we're ever going to take statewide office and really make big impacts as senators or governors, we can't walk a state. You certainly can't walk a state like Texas or California, and as you say, it takes money. And I want to know what you say to a local chamber of commerce, to the major corporations, what you say to the Chamber of Commerce. Why should they give up their incumbent? Why are they going to give up the men who have protected their interests and the power? And you talk about getting up the limits. What can we say to them to show them that we can serve their interests too and our interests? I hate it to be us, them, but how are we turning to raise the money to change it? What are you thinking of in your own districts? How to make that step, because that's going to be the step that we take.
You say to them, I can win. Yeah. Right. This is the way women are raising money in campaigns, just like men. They're just saying, I've got a viable candidacy. This is how I can win. And you show them what your plan is, why you can win, and then if you're dealing with a specific group, naturally, when you talk about issues, you want to talk about the issues that they care about. If you disagree with them on some issues, just don't mention those. Mention the ones that's just,
that's
knowing your
strategy.
audience, knowing your audience. You don't lie about anything. You don't lie. But you simply bring out the issues they care about. If you're talking about going against an incumbent, it may be that incumbent's voting record is like a 5 or a 10%, and you have looked through Congressional Quarterly or wherever the report cards are, and you know what that is. So you go in prepared, and you go in showing confidence and demonstrating that you can win. And that's the way you do it. You do it brick by brick, organization by organization. And it doesn't just happen overnight. There have been some whirlwind campaigns that have succeeded overnight by virtue of a lot of money in the media, because you say you can't go door to door. No, you can't. You do that kind of token stuff if you're running statewide, but you rely very heavily on the media, you rely very heavily on press conferences, and some people have done it overnight. But by and large, I say it's constituency building, and I say it's brick by brick, organization, and then it all begins to come together and being very active.
Than the way you would challenge an incumbent normally, that for a woman you don't have to.
No, you just say, I'm better.
way.
I'm better. But you have to believe you are better. Yes. And if you do that, you can be, and then you look at where the weaknesses are and what your strengths are, and you're natural. I mean, I believe that you don't put on a media personae because some consulting firm told you had to do it. I really think you've got to be yourself if you want to win, and you can do it.
I think that one of the other things is that I helped very heavily with the campaign of Louise Slaughter, who was the only woman from our state who was in Congress now.
She's the only woman who beat an incumbent,
And
too.
I was going to say, she's the only woman that beat
She's one
an
of that
incumbent.
2.5%.
And Louise ran a very interesting campaign in that she did not relegate herself only to New York State. She flew out to California, she flew to Washington, she flew wherever she had to go to get money. And there were lots of people throughout the country raising money for her. She ran against an incumbent. She ran against someone who had a lot of name recognition, in their particular area. And Louise is a very a very unique lady. She has a very, very thick Kentucky accent. I mean, when she was my mate in the assembly chamber for 4 years, and half the time I'd call my aunt to find out what she was talking about because my aunt was down in South Carolina, and it was interesting, but I said to myself, how is she going to win? She was in a district, ran an assembly race, won in an assembly district that had a 25% Democratic enrollment. She won as a Democrat. She then took that and kind of catapulted it and made it into something real. Joanne Woodward gave her a fundraiser in California. She came back from the West Coast. She says, I have enough money, I think I can win. Well, 3 weeks later, it was all gone because, you know, it was just being used up. And she had to, again, go back. But as was indicated, you have to believe in yourself, and you have to believe that I don't care who this incumbent is. I think I can not only do his job, but I think I can do it better. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, them against us. I think that clearly there are women that have run against other women and have won, because if you really start to believe in yourself and you break down some barriers and say, I'm going to go beyond my own border, then I think you really have a shot, and she certainly proved it.
And let me add to that people are going to put money in a campaign where they think they're going to be supporting a winner. It's simple. I mean, that's really what the bottom line is. They want to know, are you potentially going to be the person making those decisions, and I want to have an inside track. And so if you believe in yourself and sell a very comprehensive program that makes sense to them, they will go with you. I'll tell you, I raised $1,250,000 in a small state where everybody said, oh, she'll never be able to raise anything. And what I started out raising about $250,000, but when I came out of a primary as a winner, boy, did money start coming in like gangbusters. Yeah. But I will also tell you candidly, I spent 50% of my time raising money. And I had to be on the phone. I had to be at fundraising parties. And that was the only part of the campaign that I didn't like. I loved all the rest of it. But that part of it became, it just never stopped. It just never stopped.
There have been 2 studies lately which show that women, particularly women incumbents, can raise equally to any man. And so the myth that women can't raise money just isn't true.
Has more to do with
the myth is the incumbency, that they can beat an incumbent.
Can I say quickly that if every legislator brought their children to the floor of the legislature, maybe we'd have better child care in this country.
Good point.
I have a daughter who nursed her baby on the floor of the New Hampshire House who was a legislator. She went to Radcliffe, too. That's where she was.
Oh, God. Right here.
This is a question to anyone or everyone. And my question is, after the 1984 election with Geraldine Ferraro on the Democratic ticket, do you really believe that gender is an issue that we can put behind us on the national level, or are we likely to see Ted Koppel quizzing the next national female candidate about whether she cries when the press or her candidates say something nasty against her?
Well, they asked Mario Cuomo why his skin is so thin, so I think that's equivalent to asking why are you always crying when we ask you the tough questions. I don't know. I think that I don't think we're past that yet. I really don't think we're past that yet. I was talking to one of the people who was very active in the Ferraro campaign, and we were talking about the beating that she had taken, and in large part, I felt that some of the things that were said and done to and about Geraldine were not really a reflection on what she had been and who she was. Okay, and we won't get into all of that because I'm still angry about some of the things that happened. But I think that I think that on a national level that we clearly are not past that yet. I think that type of questioning is still going to be around. The man who asked me about my children, there are still people that I get letters from. Do you think is important? Somehow Geraldine Ferraro's husband and son became her whole life. They kept tying her to that. Granted, she gave birth to the son, but she certainly wasn't responsible for the husband.
I think we all agree on that one.
I think her candidacy was a step in the right direction because I think the fact that she was put on a national ticket indicates that women can be. In other words, again, it's the role model. The door is open. Now it is up to us to follow through, to insist that women be looked at as candidates. Do I think there's going to be an overnight change? I don't. The best that might happen is possibly there might be a female as vice president on the ticket in '88, probably in the Republican Party, I would guess. I don't know. Just looking around at who we've got in the wings, we've got to prepare more women, get more women to go to Congress, so they will be ready. So there will be no excuse when they say that we just don't have the women around, but it has nothing to do with the sex bias. So I think it was a step in the right direction. I cheered that there was a woman that was on a national ticket, because that's the kind of thing that we need to open the door. Because Sally Ride was an astronaut. My grandchildren or children in kindergarten can raise their hand and say, when I grow up, I want to be an astronaut. When I grow up, the little girl can say, I want to be president or vice president, because that had been set. So it's, again, part of the pioneering.
Question up here.
As I'm listening to the panel and even the questions that have just come up, it strikes me that the issue of the responsibility of child care is just so important to everything we're talking about. And whether or not we, agree whose responsibility it is, the male or the female, and I think here we'll agree it's both. I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of organized daycare on the level that elementary and secondary education is organized. And I also just wonder if, from your own personal experience, it might have delayed your movement into politics because you did have very young children at home. And I know at some point early on the question was raised, how can we get women's political careers to be longer or, equal to the extent that we can compete with men in the political arena. And I'm also just thinking that it's interesting that when we're talking about incumbents, that whole idea that women are getting a later start in it is always going to be our problem if there is not at some point we don't stop and, relieve at least one generation of, 90% of the responsibility of child care. So, what do you guys think?
Us guys, I'll tell you what we think.
We got to pass the test, girl.
This a little bit goes back to the question that the woman tried to ask us in the beginning, sort of, what's happening in those women's issues. She was discussing rape, but we also were discussing daycare. And I remember so clearly Pat Schroeder coming to speak out at a meeting of women legislators out in San Diego, 400 women legislators. And she was talking about the child care bills in the U.S. Congress. And she's such a great character. And she stood up and she sort of threw her arms out like this and she said, the men aren't going to do it for us. And what the point she was making was that you need women in your legislatures and in the Congress to put in the tough child care bills and to put in the bills that are of such primary importance to women. The AFDC payments, 98% of people on AFDC are women and children. And those sort of bills, and this is what I see in my legislature in New Hampshire, is that women really take a lead in this field. We have 2 daycare bills in, both of them put in by women, both of them, and we bring the men along. But women, that's one of the reasons you need more women, is that they see those issues.
I just wanted to add quickly that we just did some statistics, or found some statistics at my station, not only the statistic you just mentioned about women on AFDC, but in Massachusetts, more than 90% of the people who are homeless are women and children right now, which carries it on even further. So there's a whole, we'll talk about the feminization of poverty. It's a real issue that I think women politicians and women leaders are going to have to address.
Women take a real leadership role when they are elected in those issues.
But
is there another microphone up there? No. Okay.
I'm just wondering, do you think, though, that the concept of a really major organized daycare bill has any possibility of passing state or federal, in the next 5-10 years?
Let me say to you that we have just completed recommendations. I'm part of the New York State Child Care Commission, which was formulated by our governor, I guess, 2 years ago. And the subcommittee on which I served was a subcommittee on employer responsibility. And what we did was to invite 150 employers, from banks to large corporations to small corporations, and say to them, would you come and meet with us, and maybe we can talk about daycare, supplementing an employee's paycheck with that, on-site daycare, how much the employer was willing to put forward. And that afternoon we had 43 representatives from people all over the state who in fact did come. We are submitting a major daycare bill this session in our House, and we at this point do have support for it in our state Senate. I think that we have the type of support and we have the type of executive support that we as a state are moving forward to putting that type of money in place to do that. I think you have to remember, though, that you really are pulling against a lot of other tensions. For instance, last year I did a Women in Prison project, and I came back to the legislature and I said, look, we have women incarcerated in this state. 70% of them happen to be mothers, okay? And their children are all over the state. They are in foster care, they're with relatives, some of them are in shelters. And so we spent a lot of time putting in place programs to keep these women in touch with their children. That is a form of not daycare, but certainly of child care, okay? And we used a lot of money out of that same pot to do that, okay? I have just been assigned as chair of a committee on women veterans. A lot of women came out of the Vietnam conflict. People don't even know that women nurses died in Vietnam. They weren't even included in the Agent Orange suit, okay? A lot of those women have children. Some of them can't find employment. So again, we took money from that pot to say we have to do something for these women veterans. My concern at this point is that we do have this legislation that is progressive and it's innovative and it can do a lot of things. I only hope that we get not only this type of support, but in fact we can put it in place because we need a lot of dollars in order to do that. And I think that's the type of push-pull that you're going to have, at least in our state this year. I think it does not hurt that for the first time in our legislature we had a senator give birth a couple of days before special session started. So she's going to bring her baby on the floor. It's going to be a very dramatic presentation, and hopefully we'll get it through. Okay.
But I also would like to say to you that we have a lot of educating still to do, that those of us who work in the area know the tremendous need for daycare, quality daycare, that is good daycare so that families can understand that their youngsters are being cared for by people who are trained and who have an adequate salary so they stay in the business. We have to incorporate into our state packages tax incentives for industry and for corporations to make a commitment to daycare on behalf of their employees. And we need to do some lobbying, and women have got to make their voice heard. They have got to make sure that their legislators, whatever state they come from, understand that there really is a need, that it is a critical need, that we now have so many women who are single heads of household that have got to have that kind of support. But it isn't only single heads of household. There are many families for whom this is a real crisis. And it's clear, Barbara's right, the dollars it's a big ticket item. But it's got to be a priority for many young women. And it's a multiple lobbying project, and you should take a lead.
Well, I plan to, but I'm just curious, is there anything happening in Congress that we could...
There is. This is one of the most critical issues, because 75% of families, of mothers with children under age 3 will be in the workforce within the next few years. And this is why you very correctly mentioned that we're like a generation late with women getting involved in politics, because so often the care of the children. But now it's an economic necessity, and women want to continue with a career. Yes, what's happening in Congress? Well, we do have a congressional caucus for women's issues. And we have men who belong to it too, but we have women on the executive board. Pat Schroeder, who couldn't be here, and I am on the executive board too, is one of the newcomers. We have a medical and parental leave bill, which was up last year and is up again this year. I really think this year it's going to pass. It would require that there be 18 weeks leave of absence for either member, either parent actually, to take care of children for childbirth or whatever. And I think that kind of policy does foster this sort of thing. Of course, pay equity, rather, that study, and Mary Rose Oka has led the way, and I'm sponsoring with her now in terms of equity with regard to that feminization of poverty that you mentioned. Daycare is very, very important. Much of it is being done by states, as you've heard, and I know Maryland has done a lot in terms of the need for daycare, and Sue is going to comment that New Hampshire has also. But I know we now have a new consolidation of a federal agency, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, going to be going into my district in Montgomery County, and they're going to have daycare facilities. So the private sector has already had some tax initiatives. They're not moving as fast as they should be. They should be. Maybe we've got to look into why they're not moving so fast. But I think also the federal government in its own buildings should begin to take more of a lead, and I'm glad to see that happening, and I'll follow through with it.
Okay. I spent the summer working with my woman state legislator in Minnesota, and she is involved in a lot of women's issues, and she's a Democrat. So I'm wondering how you as Republicans reconcile conflicting issues of party with issues of special concern to women.
I'm a woman first. I think that says it. I mean, I was endorsed by the Women's Campaign Fund. My springboard, I mentioned I was an educator, my springboard for seeking office came when I was president of the Commission for Women in my county, which was quasi-governmental. And I testified for equity for women in education, credit, employment, and in housing. And that was when I thought, hey, I want to be on the other side where I can have more influence to make some good things happen. So I feel that every time a woman is elevated, all women are elevated and all people are elevated. And so I follow my own beliefs on that. It is the party of Abraham Lincoln. Sure, there have been digressions, but also... That was an understatement, I think, in some respects. Yeah, but remember now, former Governor George Wallace was a Democrat. I mean, so you know, you look for individuals within a party, and I have no problem. If I'm inconsistent with some of the people who happen to be in power, so be it. I'll fight for what I believe in.
The House is 11 Republicans, 11 Democrats in Congress, so it's just about even.
The women in the House?
Yeah.
What did you say? I've always been an outspoken advocate for women's issues, and that's nothing new, and I will continue to speak out on issues that I care about. And I think you will find that across the board, whether you're talking at the local level, at the state level, or at national level, there are people who will speak out and tell you where they stand on issues, and they don't always agree down the line with any party structure, and you know where we stand. That's what you got to do. You want to find people who will be very candid and outspoken, and who are willing to fight the good battle.
First of all, I hear a lot of talk about money, dollars. What proposals does any of you support to lessen the load for people who are running for public office? Campaign spending, reform, things of that nature. Secondly, I wonder if any of you would care to just say, take the three most important issues as far as you're concerned facing your community, this country, and finally, why isn't Mario?
Start with it. That's a cool. Go for it, Barbara. Well, I'll speak to you about Mario afterwards, okay? I think for me, the three most important issues, childcare certainly is one of them. The second one is housing. I live in a suburban community where, quite frankly, I don't envision either one of my children being able to afford a house in Nassau County in the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, it's impossible. And certainly if they travel, a half hour into New York City, they're not going to be able to afford an apartment. So housing is a very real issue. Not the least of the problem being that I think the homeless situation in New York City is very real, and we as suburban legislators don't see it every day, but we certainly are aware of it. And the third, and perhaps the most important issue to me, is education. In New York City, there is a 68% dropout rate amongst minority youngsters before they get to their second year of high school. That is a disaster. It is no doubt in my mind that as we, as a Black and Puerto Rican caucus, were asked to visit and to tour the prison facilities in upstate New York maybe 2 years ago, that 70% of the people that we met were blacks and Latinos, and 95% of that 70% had not gotten out of their first year of high school. So education is a key issue. There's no question about it. Housing is the second, and the third one being daycare. We currently are, and I think in part because of some of the problems that the New York City political machine has faced over the last 2 years, we are currently working on not only campaign funding and disclosure, but a lot of ethics stuff that we're just recently doing, in a way, I guess, to alleviate some of the pressure that people who can't raise money to run adequate campaigns or campaigns commensurate with those people who do get large contributions. We're working on that type of thing to even people out. I don't know. There's a lot of opposition to that type of thing, and we shall see how it works as we go through the negotiations. But well, I'm just going to leave it at that, because there's a large feeling of, look, if I can raise the dollars, why should I have any caps? Okay, and I've heard that consistently from not only people in the state legislature, but people throughout the country that I've spoken to.
Anybody else want to address this? Yeah. I agree that there's got to be something that's got to be done with regard to campaign spending. Where does the money go? It goes to the media. Almost 70% of the money I raised, and I said it was over $650,000, and I agree with what you said about it working so hard, Julie, on raising the money. It was one of the ingredients in my campaign that I had to get out there in the hustings and raise it, whether it meant phone calls, and I always said it only hurt for a few minutes when I had to dial the phone, but I had to do it in order to come up with a real credible campaign. How do you propose the limits? You've got to recognize that an incumbent, if you have a cap on it, an incumbent, probably less money would be adequate, because that person has all the perks, and I'm going to be in that position also. But nevertheless, it's there, and I recognize it. You've got to realize, do we put a limit on how much money an individual can put in of his or her own? And the person I ran against was a millionaire, multimillionaire, and so could put in a great amount. Do you limit the amount PACs put in? There is a bill that on the Senate side is being endorsed. The two major sponsors are Dornan and Byrd. But the irony of it is, Mr. Byrd, who is the majority leader in the Senate, still has his $10,000 breakfast club. So, there are some inconsistencies, nothing against him, but it's the idea. We're talking about campaign reform and putting limits. I'd like to see the media, television is what I really mean, not the pencil media. I think if the media restricted, I hate to say restrict, but restricted maybe the number of commercials that you could buy, under any circumstances, not if you pay more money, you get more time, restricted it and gave you some good free time, and not at 3 o'clock in the morning or 5:30 in the morning, then I think that may be a way to approach it. But there will be others, and I will be looking at the other possibilities. What are my priorities? Trying to reduce the deficit, without hitting the people needs, and it sounds good, and it's not going to be easy to do. We spend $350 million a day interest on our national debt alone. I'd like to look at the agricultural reform policy. I think that's a good way of trying to reduce by about $26 billion some of the major problems that we've had in the United States, and debt collection should be accelerated. There are a number of ways we can try to do that. Federal employees are important to me. They live right in my backyard, and I'm on a committee where I will be looking to them as the lifeblood of our government in terms of recognition and promoting productivity, and arms control. Of course, I'm an educator. Arms control is very important to me. Nobody wins a nuclear war, and I think this next 2 years or so very critical in terms of coming to grips with reducing the strategic nuclear arsenals of the major nations.
I can be very brief. I would support the Common Cause bill on putting a cap on funding. The problem is to make it constitutional. My 3 issues would probably be AFDC, which is my main interest now, and I've got on Senate Finance just to address that. The tax structure of the state of New Hampshire, but I've been in the legislature since 1969. I came in to change the tax structure, and nothing's changed since I got there, even though I got to be chairman of Ways and Means. And third, the issue of Seabrook in New Hampshire is a very, very important one.
And I guess most every state has the same crying need for housing. It certainly is a critical one in my state. Again, the Northeast, where we just simply do not have adequate housing. We have homeless and we have young people who just simply cannot enter the housing world. It is painful for them. My other particular interests are in the arena of transportation, because in the Northeast we desperately need to do something about both our infrastructure and mass transportation, which I think is critical for us to look towards the year 2000, or we're all going to be at gridlock. I am an environmentalist, and I'm deeply concerned about the whole array of environmental issues, clean water, clean air, and they've been my concern for a long time. In terms of campaign spending reform, by gum, we got to do something. It is really obscene, fellas and ladies. And the amount of money that is spent on campaigns and the kinds of campaigns that we are now seeing, the very negative kinds of campaigns, I think do a grave disservice to the public and have, I believe, turned the public off. And the low voter turnout in this past election, I think, is one of the things that I think has affected people is their disenchantment with the political process, and a part of that is because of the incredible spending and the advertising that is very negative. And so I think we've got to get a handle on campaign spending. It is simply not acceptable any longer.
We're going to take one more question, and this lady's been standing here for quite a while, so we'll let you have the last question.
Thank you. I've been very impressed with the candidates and their the panelists. Yeah, once and future.
We'll answer to that.
And especially with your list of issues that I was thankful that you got to. There are two issues that are dear to my heart and have been for a long time, and have been to many people's hearts that were conspicuously absent. And I think that there are a couple of reasons for that. One, they have been, like women ourselves, bashed and battered over the last 10 years. And I would like you to speak to these issues, whether or not they're dead, whether they'll ever arise again. Is it worth your political capital to spend your time, energy, and money on them? That's the Equal Rights Amendment and comparable worth.
The first bill I introduced, co-sponsored in Congress, was the Equal Rights Amendment. And when I talked about my involvement with the Commission for Women in my state, when I testified, that was one of the things I testified on. It was back in, we're talking about 72, 73. And we got an Equal Rights Amendment to our state constitution. So my state of Maryland has operated with an Equal Rights Amendment to its state constitution, and also has passed the constitutional amendment. And I do firmly believe the Equal Rights Amendment is ultimately going to pass. While we keep working on that, at the same time, it is important to go through with other laws that are important because we don't have an Equal Rights Amendment. And your second question was, what was the other issue you mentioned? Comparable worth. Yeah, I was on a program with Charles Krauthammer, who is a syndicated columnist, etc., and I took the side of the need for comparable worth legislation. And when I talk about that study that Mary Rose Ocob was involved in last year and introducing, that's back again this year, it really is, we call it pay equity. It is really comparable worth, because it is to look at what the federal government is particularly paying the people for what they are doing. I think it is a travesty when, a clerk in a liquor store is making more than a kindergarten teacher, and you find, nurses making less than people packing newspapers and delivering it. The litany goes on. And I think it's important for us to demonstrate, and as a country, that we place not only the salary, we place more worth in the fact that someone is teaching our young people than selling alcohol. So I will... I hope not. But I think these are very important issues, and I will work for it, and my colleagues, many of them too.
Does anybody else want to address that now?
I mean, you want to leave it at that.
ERA. I'll talk to the ERA. I was one of those gutsy people I was a delegate to the Republican convention in 1982. I was on the platform committee, and I was one of 3 people who voted against the platform because it had dropped the ERA, which had long time been a Republican support. In fact, the Republican Party was very first and out there front and center early in support of the Equal Rights Amendment, and I simply could not support a proposal that did not, in fact, continue to include support of the Equal Rights Amendment, and I will continue to speak out on that issue. Comparable worth, many states have begun to address that question. My state has done it, and I have been there fighting for it, and in tandem with that has got to be an evaluation of all jobs, and so there's a lot of homework that has to be done before you can actually, at the federal level, talk to the question of comparable worth, and I think we got to start talking about that, an evaluation of federal jobs, and in fact, how we can match those salary levels. In my state, we have done that and have, in fact, gone beyond the point where we understand and know exactly what jobs fit in which category, and it's going to be a major task at the federal level and federal employees.
We in New York State do have a comparable worth agreement with the CSEA, the Civil Service Employees Association, and have had that for 3 years. And it's something that certainly we deal with as a women's caucus. We deal with. I do say this to you, and I'm going to be partisan only for 20 seconds, and you'll forgive me. I think, however, that when you have, and let me not say an administration, but let me say that when you have a representative of an administration that stays on a radio program for 3 hours, as happened recently, when Clarence Pendleton gets on and says that comparable worth is Looney Tunes, it kind of takes away from the fabric of what you're trying to get across. And he is saying this as a representative of the administration. That makes things very difficult, okay? And I think that when you start to marry comparable worth with equal rights, with the Equal Rights Amendment, and you get to Looney Tunes somehow, it's not going anyplace, okay? So we need people like this to get back on those platforms and remind them where they came from.
Could I just make one comment on the ERA? I just, because I don't think that the president, it has nothing to do with the Equal Rights Amendment in this instance, thank God. But I do want to point out that the Equal Right Amendment is to be ratified by the states. I do want to point out that it has been held up in states that have the Democratic majority. And I think that's something where we need everybody to work for it.
Well, let me just say, as a follow-up, that George Bush voted for the Equal Rights Amendment and then reversed himself. So maybe they'll run him next time, and maybe he'll have another shot. And I'm not being very partisan about this. Yes.
We have to move on, ladies. Right? We have to move on. Okay.
Nope. We have the Equal Rights Amendment in New Hampshire on a state level, but I was very saddened by the loss in Vermont. That was a tough battle and a nasty one, and we were having an equal opportunity study in our personnel right now in New Hampshire.
Okay. We want to thank you all. Before we wrap this up, I wanted to introduce to you Carol Rubin with the Kennedy School Women's Caucus, who has an announcement to make, I believe.
On behalf of the women's group, I wanted to thank the panel and to invite everybody to a reception afterwards in the Institute of Politics.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to add my thank yous to the panel. This has been a very refreshing and energetic kind of forum for me as a member of the media. I've learned a lot, and I thank you all for allowing me to do that. I think we always speak in terms of women's issues, but I can tell you from research on some of the women's issues that we've mentioned this. These are not women's issues. This is society's issues, because our children are the future. So we have to take care of our children. Comparable worth or pay equity, that's just fair. Women are not in the workforce because we're choosing to go out between tennis and racquetball to be in the workforce. Women are out there because they have to work. So I think you have to address those issues as society's issues, and I'm not running for anything, but I certainly see as a member of the media that they are issues that we all have to be aware of and address. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you'll see you at the reception.